Welcome to America's Web Radio. This is Ron Bachman, and you're on Healthcare Insight. We want to talk about the healthcare of this country domestically, foreign policy, domestic policy, taxes, social policies, all those different areas is what this program is all about. And clearly, this week, if you've been watching the news at all, if you haven't been a hermit up someplace up on some mountaintop or out on vacation sitting on the beach not listening to any news, you know that the Russian Ukraine conflict is about to occur, may occur, is likely to occur. We really don't know, but there are Russians and troops that are on the border. They've been building up on the Ukrainian border. It's complicated because there are a couple of separatist provinces, if you will, areas outside of Ukraine that Ukraine claims as theirs, but they would like to be separate countries. And Russia wants to claim them, has said they are separate states, and so they can deal with those states without saying they're invading Ukraine. But what most people don't know, and what I want to get into today, is to share with you a rather shocking discovery that I made just by looking up some of the history of Ukraine and the Russia relationships to see how strong they are. You almost, from the news reports out there, think that Ukraine has a lot of Russians in it. It used to be part of the Soviet empire, and so it's only natural that Putin, who wants to rebuild the Soviet empire, would just say, well, those are my people, so I want to bring them back in. But I want to talk today about a surprising development that I've come across. Because most of us, when we think about history, other than history teachers, we all don't really know or study a lot of history. But I want to take you back to a very important period of time before we get into the Ukraine Russia activity that's going on today, and look at what was happening between Ukraine and Russia in 1932 to 1933. Because there's something there called the Holodomor. And the Holodomor is a period of time that has a name. It was also called the Terror Famine or the Great Famine. And it was a famine in the Soviet Ukraine at the time that killed millions, some say 4 million to 7 million people, Ukrainians. And it was a large part of a wider Soviet famine that was going on, but there was a special emphasis being put on the way the Russians wanted the Ukrainians to starve. They actually went in and they first cut off the grain supply by taking it out. They put quotas on each of the communities, each of the cities there, to take out as much grain as they possibly could, leaving a bare minimum for subsistence of the Ukrainians. They thought they would sort of starve out the Ukrainians who had been anti-Soviet. But the reality is that the ingenuity of the Ukrainians was such that they weren't being starved out. In fact, Ukraine has typically been called in the past the breadbasket of Europe. And so it's a very fertile country with a lot of produce coming out of it, a lot of wheat and grain. But the Soviets weren't able to cut off that supply by taking out with heavy quotas. The people lived on the little subsistence grain that was left. But then, during this 1933 period, the Russians actively went in and took out any remaining grain, any potatoes, any kind of vegetables, any fruits. Everything was taken out of the Ukraine area to literally starve the people into total and complete submission. And actually, it was genocide. So that's the backdrop. The Ukrainians don't have anything in common with the Russians, given the history of starving and killing the Ukrainian people. Many families today in Ukraine experience this. They may have been the very few that came through. Many Ukrainians left the country. So there is a bitter fight between Ukrainians and Russia. So unlike the current media, the kind of papers over all this, it's a forgotten part of the history, and nobody's bringing it forward to say there is a natural dislike of one culture to the other culture, of one people to the other people because of that history. And many people who fled Ukraine are now trying to raise awareness of this Holodomor. So I want to talk to a real expert, a Valentina Krodia from that period of country. She's now living in Canada because she was one of the few survivors, I guess, out of that whole process. So I'd like to talk to her today on this podcast and have her give you some of the detailed backgrounds of this conflict period and how it affects even today's potential conflict of Russia going into Ukraine. So let me ask Valentina, what is this? Can you tell us a little bit more detail about this Holodomor?
Well, it comes from two Ukrainian words. The first word is holod, the first part of it, and that means famine or starvation in Ukrainian. And the second portion, holodomor, mor, comes from the verb morete, which means to cause or inflict a torturous death. So basically, when you put it together, it means death inflicted by starvation. Some people have said it was murder by starvation, but I think murder is a very gentle thing in the sense that murder usually thinks someone just been killed, and that's it. But something like the Holodomor, it took 3 to 4 months for a person to die a torturous death.
Valentina, this sounds like a horrific event that occurred, a real disaster to the extreme of like Hitler and Nazis killing 6 million Jews. But we're so U.S. centric, and the current generation doesn't really get taught or learn much about history. So could you enlighten this audience on what this Holodomor really is all about and what's the history behind it?
It occurred under Soviet rule. When the Soviet Union was set up, Ukraine was reconquered from the short period of the Russian Revolution where Ukraine tried to set up its independent state. It was reconquered by the Red Army, and it became part of the Soviet Union in 1922. By 1928, Stalin became the supreme ruler or the dictator of the Soviet Union, and at that time he introduced the 5-year plan.
Okay, so Stalin takes over complete control of Russia. This is after Lenin was in charge of the revolution in China or in Russia. And as a consequence, Stalin wanted to put in this 5-year plan. So he's going to try to consolidate his power and put in various programs that are going to create a loyalty, a subservience of all these different regions, all these different ethnicities to make them loyal to him. So tell me what happened with that 5-year plan. What did Stalin find out when it came to Ukraine?
What he noticed about Ukraine was that the Ukrainians were quite nationally conscious. They had tried to set up an independent Ukraine, and they were not too keen on communism. And when he brought in two things that he wanted to bring in was industrialization and collectivization. He wanted to make Russia a powerful state so that he could conquer the world. That's what they said at that time. And and the only thing he could do it with was to have a cash crop to buy industrial machines. And that meant that the only thing they could sell to the rest of the world was the grain from Ukraine, because Ukraine was the breadbasket of Europe.
Okay, Valentina, so I think our audience is starting to see, at least I'm getting a sense here of what was going on, that Ukraine's the breadbasket of the European area, certainly the breadbasket of the Russian territories that Stalin was trying to consolidate and to build on for his worldwide dominance concept that he had in mind. But Ukraine had people who were very independent-minded and really didn't want to be part of the Soviet Union, didn't want to be subjugated by Stalin. So he had to do something that would change that dynamic. So what was the process that he went about in this period, again, of 1932 to 1933 that changed the dynamics and the relationships between Ukraine and Russia?
So they decided to take away all private land that had been owned by farmers. There had been about 5 million individual farms in Ukraine. And these were to be now put into 25,000 collective farms, or kolhos, as they called them.
Many might say that the Ukrainian starvation and the difficulties of getting food was just part of the overall Soviet problem of feeding its people during this period of Stalin's rule. But the reality is that they did more than just have a difficult time eating. Didn't the Soviet Union just absolutely come in and take away the food, not just in quotas for people to feed grain back to Moscow, but in fact they sent in troops that confiscated all of the food as much as they possibly could to take it away from the Ukrainians, and with the purpose of letting them starve. Is that correct?
That's right. Ukrainians were actually targeted. There's no question of it. Some of the laws that were instituted by the Soviet government were set up specifically for Ukraine. They wanted to suppress the population. The largest number of revolts. Of course, the Ukrainian farmer didn't just sit and take it, that they're going to be taking my land away. I'm not going to just sit here and wait for it to happen. There were revolts, and hundreds, and they said up to 1,000 revolts in 1930 alone. So some of them were quite small. And that sort of thing happened. So obviously Stalin knew that the Ukrainians were not going to take it lying down.
Well, Valentina, what you've described is a real horror of the Soviet Union, of the communist regime, of Stalin. It's an indictment on all of them and all of that governing structure of communism, that they have no morals, that they will go in and they will starve people to death. They will kill people to achieve their ends. This is a very different picture of the relationship between Ukraine and the Soviet Union that we would hear on the nightly news. It's almost as if this history didn't exist, doesn't exist. It's out of people's minds. The media is too dumb to actually look back at the history and find out where these conflicts have originated from and why the Soviet Union wants to come back in, maybe to get grain. Maybe the Soviet people in today's world are having a hard time struggling. Maybe there's other reasons for Putin to want to do this and upset the world order that we're in today. But in any case, I want to come back and I want to continue this discussion with Valentina Kuroda. So if you'll hang with us, audience, just listen to this message, this advertisement, and we will be right back. Welcome back to Healthcare Insight on America's Web Radio. Today we are talking about the relationships, the history between Russia and Ukraine. It is what's in the news. Most Americans don't have that history. I certainly didn't know about it until I started doing some research for this program, and it is absolutely astounding. Many historians have added up the number of deaths from the communist run countries, because when communists come into power, they typically will kill all of the previous leaders, and sometimes many of the early generations of children who were exposed to a different system, the non-communist system, whether that's capitalism, socialism, whatever it was, when it doesn't please the rulers, whether it's Mao, who killed would estimate 70 million people, whether it's Lenin and Stalin, who killed another 20 million, whether it's the dictators in Vietnam or in North Korea or in Venezuela. Every time the Soviet system comes into play, there's a process that they need to cleanse the population of any dissenters. It happened in Cuba, just off our borders. So this is nothing new. And so in order for the communist countries to take hold of power, they need to do this kind of ethnic cleansing in some areas, dissenter cleansing, religious cleansing, whatever it is. They will stop at nothing to gain and control and hold on to power. That's what this is really all about. So here we're talking about what Stalin did to the Ukrainian people. And when he found out that they were going to be resistant, that there were revolts across the country, as they knew that Stalin was going to come in and try to take over their lands and control their farming activities, um, the Soviet Union at that time under Stalin decided they're going to have to crack down on these recalcitrant people, these people who were not going to just fall in line. So, what did Stalin do as a result of this kind of an attitude on the Ukrainian farmers in particular?
And as a result, he put up certain restrictions on them. Once they set up the collective farms, the collective farms had fantastic quotas on them, very high quotas for the number of tons of grain they were supposed to provide to the government. And only after the government got its take would the farmers be given some kind of salary.
So, Valentina, the key to this whole thing then is that the government sets quotas, and if you don't meet them, you're going to be out of the job, you're going to be fired, you're going to be killed, you're going to be persecuted, you're going to be arrested, whatever the punishment's going to be. But the government sets a quota, regardless of what the crop actually that occurs during that year, whatever is grown doesn't matter. The centralized Russian government demand a certain amount of grain be sent to the government. And then whatever might be left over, the people will have to eat, or they'll pay them a salary, as you said. But isn't that the key to how you squeeze down a population like Stalin did here, just to take away the people, create collective farms, remove the farmers that have been growing and been the breadbasket of that European area for decades, if not centuries? And what you do is you just put them on farms, you take away the private ownership, and you make demands that are completely unreasonable so that you know that the end result is going to starve them out. Isn't that the real key to how all this works?
And that's the key to the whole thing, that they raised the quota in Ukraine 4 times for that year in 1932, 1933. The Ukrainian farmers could not, on the collective farms, meet those quotas. First of all, just the very fact that things had changed overnight. I mean, the successful farmers were in concentration camps, so they had been executed. The ones who were left were leaderless. Things had to change. And that was in itself a problem. So they basically decided that in this way they're going to pacify this community, and that would oppress them, make sure that they fear the Soviet government, and they're not going to be thinking of independence for decades.
So this was clearly a planned, purposeful starvation of people to subjugate them, to take away the leadership, to take away any kind of creative association that might exist among neighbors. What else did they do? What other, so we can sort of understand the typical activity that occurs under a communist Soviet Union type system? This also sounds very familiar with what Mao did in China, what many other countries do. So give us a flavor of what they also did next to try to subjugate the people of Ukraine.
One of the other things they did was they blacklisted villages. If you didn't meet your quota, they said it was sabotage, rather than believing that maybe these people really had nothing left to do. They didn't have any food. For example, even seed grain was taken away, which meant you couldn't even plant the next season's crop if you didn't have that.
Okay, so Valentina, what you're describing here is a horrific set of events that's basically run by regulations, bureaucrats under the guise and direction of the Soviet political leadership. But when and how did they then, if that didn't work, did they bring in troops? Did they surround the villages? Did they come in with their armies in order to subjugate the people? Because that would seem like a logical next step.
And then they went in. So when they decided that the village was committing sabotage against the Soviet government, they surrounded the village with troops, and they wouldn't let anything come in or anyone to leave. which meant it was a certain death sentence. And 1/3 of all the villages in Ukraine were treated like that.
So the Soviet Union and Stalin and the communists, the whole Russian Empire as it existed, as Putin wants to sort of reestablish, amazingly enough, found various ways to subjugate people, to punish people, to kill people, to put them in collectives if they didn't produce because they didn't have the goods, they didn't have the seeds to even plant. It was purposeful starvation of the people with a process of bureaucratic rules, regulations, and now, as you've described it, more military. Was there another step? Was there another level of military involvement in this process to subjugate the Ukrainians?
The other thing they did was they sent in brigades, and they took even pumpkins and onions. People dried fruit for the winter. People could survive without wheat, but they can't survive if there's nothing else to eat. So they took absolutely everything from a lot of the villages, and that's where you had the big concentration of deaths.
Valentina, I understand that we've been talking about sort of the grain production and the Soviet Union coming in and taking away the grain from the people, but I'm sure the history, and I think if you could enlighten the audience here a little bit more, it wasn't just the grain producers, it was people all across the country in various areas of production, whether it's the north or the south. But give us a little bit more of a flavor of how all this thing transpired and how the Ukrainians in different parts of the country, maybe with different occupations, showed a level of resistance that the Russians felt they had to absolutely crush by starvation of the entire country.
And the largest number of victims were not in the grain growing area, which is in the south, but in the forest steppe region, where a lot of the opposition to Soviet rule had been.
So the process is pretty clear. They start off with rules and regulations and bureaucracies that crush the people in terms of being able to deliver on goals and requirements that would starve them out. Then they come in with the military to make it even worse, and then they personalize it to different parts of the country of where you have the most rebellious people and where you have the food that they're trying to take away from the people. All this is part of a pattern of Soviet Union crushing people, but it's not just the Soviet Union, it's communism. It's what Castro did, it's what Mao did, it's what every communist country in their takeover tends to do to eliminate the opposition, to eliminate the leadership. So there's got to be another level that you can describe to us, and that is, how do you work on the people's psyche after you've destroyed their jobs, destroyed their life, you've killed off many of the leaders? What are some of the things that is typical that we might actually see in the coming weeks here in 2022 as the Soviet Union continues this kind of brutality against other people?
They were doing two-pronged sort of system they brought in. They eliminated the private ownership, and they also tried to eliminate Ukrainian identity and nationalism at the same time.
So, Valentina, with all these crushing aspects, and it's well documented how the communists will do this in any country they take over, but this is sort of really egregious. This is completely purposeful of one country against another country as they begin to dominate them. But what's the issue here when we hear that there were 25,000 deaths a day in Ukraine from this activity that the Russians were using to subjugate, to destroy the people of Ukraine? Is that a crazy number, that there were 25,000 deaths a day in Ukraine? And you know that history doesn't go away. It's from the 1930s, but there are families still existing that have had their loved ones murdered and killed under this Russian dominance that happened, and they certainly don't want that to happen again. So what's the actual numbers, as best you can tell us, of how horrific the impact was of the Russian dominance and trying to destroy Ukrainian people?
Statistics I got from demographers is up to 28,000 a day, and that would have been in June of 1933. And that is because after the winter, there's absolutely nothing left to eat. There's nothing, no matter what you did. They ate bark, they ate weeds, they ate everything that they could get their hands on. There were no birds left. There was nothing left because they tried to do what they could to survive.
You know, Valentina, a lot of people will throw out high numbers for sort of the shock value, if you will, but clearly people have been looking at this, some historians, some demographers, on the number of deaths. Obviously, a lot of it is lost in history, so many of the international historians have kind of ignored this, but there has been a cadre of people who have looked at and studied this horrific event that happened in 1932 to subjugate the people of Ukraine. Can you give us a little bit more flavor on how solid these numbers are so that we can rely on the fact that this is one of the greatest murders in the history of mankind?
The numbers themselves are still being thrown about. The demographers who deal with a scientific approach to the numbers of people who died, these are excessive deaths. This is not, everybody knows that there's a certain number of people who die each year. But this is excessive deaths over what was expected. Comes up to 4 million in the actual territory of Ukraine. They can verify that, as best they can with their type of system. Now, some people have said it's much higher. Again, there are different ways of calculating that. And whether we will ever know the exact number is questionable, too.
Well, let's take another quick break, and we'll be right back to find the history and the relationships and the background and the real story behind the conflicts that have been going on for decades and decades between Russia and Ukraine. This is nothing new. It's happened before. It's sort of a back to the future concept of what's actually going on, and we can see the brutality of what the Russians have done in the past. And I think we all understand and accept now that Putin can be just as ruthless as Stalin was to get his way. So stay with us, and we'll be right back for more of this very interesting history of Ukraine. Welcome back to America's Web Radio. Today we are talking about the historical relationship between Ukraine and Russia. We know that today, and maybe even by the time you hear this presentation, which is only a day or so ahead of where I'm recording it, you may have Russia already invading Ukraine. This is not something new. The Ukrainian people were subjugated by the Russians in the past. They were part of the Soviet Union, and the belief is that Putin wants to put back together, if you will, the Soviet Union. But when the Soviet Union subjugated these different territories, these different countries at the time, they were brutal in what they did to take the assets out of the country. Ukraine apparently is a breadbasket, very fertile country with good farmers. It has good minerals in parts of the country. So there is an economic reason why the Soviet Union would like to once again dominate the Ukrainian people. So I want to continue this history lesson of the conflicts that have occurred as recently as the 1930s and how brutal the Soviet Union was in treating the Ukrainian people, starving them to death. It was really another Holocaust, if you will. In fact, they call it a holodrome. And the reason is that so many people were purposefully starved to death by the Soviets. So I want to go back to Valencia and have her tell us a little bit more about the deaths that occurred. Was it in the millions, and maybe how did it affect children?
But it's in the millions. There's no question of it. And one of the things that you should know is that 31% of all the deaths were children under the age of 10. So you're talking about 1/3. So even if you're talking about the modest number of 4 million, you're talking about at least 1.25 million of children who died.
Valentina, this is just such an unbelievable story, a chapter in history that is so shameful. Tell us more about what happened to the families that lived there and how they survived or didn't survive, or how they, the few maybe that made it through here, were even able to do that. But tell us about the family difficulties during this terrible occupation and imposition of starvation policies by the Russians over the Ukrainian people.
His whole families were wiped out. A lot of people were also sent to the Gulag, the concentration camps, if they opposed, or they ended up in Siberia, for example, or they were executed.
Valentina, I understand you're currently living in Canada, so obviously your family was one that either got out or was a survivor. Can you tell us a little bit about your own personal story related to this historic tragedy?
I just found out about my family. I'm a daughter of two survivors. And my father's family were labeled as kulaks. They were the most prominent family in this small, well, it's a big village just outside the city of Kiev. And none of my cousins know about my grandfather because the family never told them anything. They were, families were afraid to speak about this to their children for fear they're going to go to school and question the teachers in the history class, where the Holodomor was completely forbidden to be spoken of. And so I went to the secret service, I guess, of Ukraine these days, because I'm working with some historians, and they put me in contact with them, and they did me a favor. They found my grandfather's papers, and in it, I found out he was arrested in 1928, one of the first to be arrested as a kulak in December, and that he didn't own a lot of land, but he did own a store along with some land. And I also found out that he was organizing people against collectivization. And for that, he ended up in prison until 1937, where he died.
Valentina, I know that must have been very difficult to find out about what your father and how he died in prison, but maybe some pride that he stood up early on and risked his life and ultimately gave that ultimate sacrifice. But did that give you any sort of comfort or closure to know those kinds of details about your own father?
It was for me, and I was the one from outside of Ukraine who sent the information to them. It was all written in Russian. I had it translated, even though I know Russian. I've studied it, but I told them, I said, we have to know this, and we have to know why this happened. Even my own father didn't tell me much about it, about his what happened to him, except that he died in prison, but they knew even less than I did about the details because they were told it was better that they didn't know, so they never had to be questioned.
I know you said that many people really didn't want to talk about it. They wanted to almost forget it, or they were afraid to speak out that they would then be targeted again, but did you hear stories as a youth? Did your parents say anything about so that you knew and understand about the tragedy that had occurred, even if maybe you didn't know some of the details?
Yes, they did. I don't think there was a time when I didn't know about the Holodomor. My mother also lived through it. She was an 11-year-old child when it happened. My father was 19, so he was a little older, 1920. So he knew a lot about it. And I was born in a DP camp, a displaced persons camp in Germany, in Mannheim, Germany, after the war. I was born right after the war in 1945. So that most of the people that were in these camps had been people from there. There were lots of Ukrainians because the Germans took them out as Nazi slave laborers, as they did my parents. So my parents had lived through the communists and the Nazis. So they've been traumatized, you might say, with a double whammy.
Valentina, the media in the present day, 2022, is talking about an outgoing migration of people from Ukraine into Poland, into other countries where they can escape this kind of expected brutality that the Soviet system, the communist system, imposes on people. Your family went through this as you described. I understand that your family immigrated to Canada. Can you tell us about how that process works so we can understand how people who want to leave that kind of brutality can go to another country and have some difficulties in assimilation, but basically wind up creating their own culture in a new country, but also sort of participating in that melting pot concept that we talk about in the United States, but I think also is there in Canada. So give us a little bit about your very personal story of immigrating to Canada.
And in Montreal, where we immigrated, we actually, my parents were part of a parish. It was the Ukrainian Orthodox Church of Canada parish that was set up specifically of people who had come from central and eastern Ukraine who had lived through this. Because the Ukrainians who have already been in Canada, they didn't understand what these people had lived through, and they couldn't find some common language. So they set up their own church. And I grew up with everybody having a story. I felt my father's trauma. My mother was angry most of the time about this, what had happened to her. My father was very quiet, and he internalized it. And he also spent 2.5 years in the concentration camp under Stalin. Because Stalin, when he labeled a family as being kulaks and enemies of the people, it transferred on to the rest of the family. So he ended up going to a concentration camp at the age of 21.
You know, Valentia, it is such a powerful story, and you have such personal connection to this history that in some ways has been lost to many people. The whole story of the brutality of the Russians, maybe because they were being brutal to their own people and they had been sort of a closed society. But you have a very personal story that is worth telling. How did this affect you as you assimilated into the North America, into Canada, and had your own life and career? Tell me about how you progressed with this whole notion of your family having suffered in such a horrific way.
You know, I know it's affected me. I felt I had to know about it. And so I studied history at McGill University, and I went into teaching. And when I retired from teaching, I felt I had to do something about getting it into curriculum. And that's what I've been doing for the last 12 years.
Well, we've gone from sort of the general horrors of what Russia did to Ukrainians to a little bit more specific and personal impact that it's had. And I think our audience will find that important to sort of flesh out this a little bit more. Is there a personal story or something that you can relate to our audience that you can recall from talking to maybe your grandmother or somebody of that era who had to live through all this? Can you tell us a little bit about that kind of exposure from a personal family member that lived through this?
Well, my grandmother, I saw my grandmother twice in my life. You know, with growing up as a child of refugees, it meant that we never could communicate with the family. And my mother wrote letters once a decade, and I went to Ukraine for the first time in 1968, and then I went in 77. And I was given permission to visit them in their village for a couple of hours at a time. And the second time, they let me even sleep over. And I spent the whole night talking to my grandmother.
Just to quickly jump in here for our audience, people who forget about their history at times, when you went to visit your grandmother, this was when Ukraine was still under the Soviet Union, the rule of the Soviets. And so that's why you had such limited access. There was not easy travel to countries that were behind the Iron Curtain, as we called it at the time. So tell us a little bit more about what she said and the experiences that you're able to glean from those few discussions you had with her.
And she told me one story that was that really upset me. And this was the fact. She was working on a collective farm in a coal husp. And she said that to feed her children, there was a distillery in the town. And the distillery, to make alcohol, needs grain. So they had all kinds of grain under a tarps, you know, these huge piles of grain that they were using to ferment for alcohol. And at the end of the day, they had a huge pit outside in the yard where they would throw the chaff into it at the end of it. In other words, the garbage that came out after the liquor is formed. And she said that basically she would go there every day with 2 pails that she would have on a stick across her shoulders. She would go to pick up this stuff. Some of the people that lined the outside of this pit fell in and drowned, but she would somehow get the stuff out of there, take it home. She would wash it, she would dry it, she would grind it, and whatever little thing they had. They did have a cow that was so ornery that even the communists didn't want to have anything to do with this cow. And so she used some of that milk, and then whatever else that she could find, weeds and stuff like that, she would make some form of bread. And that is one of the reasons why they were kept alive.
Well, thank you for your story. It is so detailed. It gives us the overview of the history of the country, of the Ukrainian conflicts with Russians, and also a very personal impact of what happens to these tragedies. They're not just numbers on a page or numbers in some history book, but they're actual human stories of substance, of importance to really understand the horrors that people have to go through with repressive regimes coming in and invading their country, which we are about to see in 2022. So stay with us, audience. We want to wrap up this discussion on Ukraine and Russia, a little bit of the history, a little bit of the impact of the people. So we'll be right back for the final session. Welcome back to America's Web Radio. Today we have been talking about the historical conflicts and problems between Ukraine and Russia. It's in the news today. It's in the news now. Looks like Russia is going to invade Ukraine, or at least capture the separatist states that are associated with Ukraine that I guess for some reason or other have been trying to establish their own countries. But Russia now is saying they're their own country, and I think will enter into those areas. As of today, it looks like there is some shelling going on. But just to give a quick summary of sort of the current state where we are, I want you to listen to this German news broadcast on what the current state is, because Germany is such an important part. It is right near this area, and it's one of the most powerful countries in Europe that will be affected by any kind of major conflict that breaks out between Russia and Ukraine. So here's a snippet of the current broadcast that's being shown in Germany.
Well, Russia's escalation of the crisis over Ukraine has brought a flood of condemnation from Western leaders. President Putin's decision to recognize 2 breakaway regions of eastern Ukraine as independent states has also prompted punitive sanctions. The toughest at this stage is likely to be Germany's decision to halt the key Nord Stream 2 gas pipeline project. This has been built to bring Russian gas to Europe, but still needs the go-ahead from German regulators, which Chancellor Scholz now says has been suspended indefinitely.
The halting of the pipeline remains the most significant step taken in response to Russia's latest escalation.
Let's hear from one of the chief editors of this German broadcast on her take on what's happened with the Nord Stream pipeline. I guess the chancellor finally decided to do something and actually mentioned the words Nord Stream pipeline, which hadn't been on the table before. At least it was being held off while he was meeting with Putin in Moscow.
Absolutely. He's pulled the plug on it. He will smother that project in German bureaucracy, which is a sure way to keep it from going online for a pretty long time. He's making it subject to a new energy strategic analysis. So that will take some time. And clearly, he also said that what just happened will play a huge role in that. Translated, that means Russia clearly is not to be trusted. And what does that mean in European and German energy security? He so tried to avoid saying Nord Stream 2. Even when he was standing next to Joe Biden, the US president, he wouldn't say it outright, even when Biden said he would ensure that this project does not go ahead if Russia crosses that border. And that's because not mentioning it was his entry ticket into talks. He went to Moscow last week. I was able to go with him on that trip. There he also was still trying to avoid going too deep in the issue of Nord Stream 2, which is so important for Russia. And now to no avail. He's pulled the plug on it for now, for sure.
So is cutting off the Nord Stream 2 pipeline going to hurt the German people directly, because you were expecting a certain amount of oil, of gas through that pipeline?
Actually, the full capacity of Nord Stream 2, that first pipeline that is connecting Russia directly with Germany, it's not actually on full throttle capacity. The real issue is that the storage here in Germany and Europe was low, and that Russia is only delivering by the book. It is not delivering anything. It doesn't absolutely have to by contract. And this is really the big question, whether Europe can afford to spend a winter without more Russian gas. Will Russia now stick to its contracts? But we've heard from Brussels that the EU, for now, is confident that, yes, it can. But we're also already hearing there are big fears, and consumers will feel this in Europe, that energy prices will go through the roof.
Well, for those listeners who have been with us this whole hour, it sounds like a very typical strategy of communists. In the 30s, they starved Ukraine by taking out the wheat and then sending in soldiers and depleting the food supplies that existed then. The modern day version that may very well be to try to squeeze the Europeans as an entire country of its oil supply, of its natural gas, of the energy that it needs to be able to heat homes and to run vehicles and to have delivery trucks. And every product that's made in Europe probably has some aspect of oil in it, of the energy production of the goods as well. So this is a tactic that we've seen. That's why I wanted to have this program that started off with some of the history and the techniques that the communists use to try to defeat another country, to demoralize them, to bring them to their knees. In the 30s, it was about food, and today it's about the power of energy that can have an impact. So I want to go back to the editor on the German telecast and ask the question, has any of these diplomatic means, as any of the idea that, okay, they're going to live up to their contract for what they've already promised, has any of this actually worked to change the attitudes or the opinions of the Russians as we begin to impose some level of sanctions?
It didn't stop what certainly Washington is now calling an outright invasion. The US is now using that term. The big question is, can it still be contained in some shape or form? And how hard are these sanctions going to be that are now drawn up? There seems to be a sense, I was at the Munich Security Conference this weekend, the Americans were already going a step further. There are also quite a few members of Congress, particularly from the Republicans, who'd called for sanctions, preemptive sanctions, to avoid Vladimir Putin even taking it this far. So I think there will be a lot of soul-searching done whether sanctions shouldn't have started earlier. They are arriving now. They did not deliver in the sense of avoiding a full-on escalation. And the big question now is how much longer Kiev will hold out, not giving Russia a pretext for open fighting.
Given the history of the Russian-Ukrainian conflicts that have occurred and what Russia has done, just taking over and subverting the people of Ukraine, and also the history and attitudes of Putin wanting to expand his Russian empire and try to rebuild the Soviet Union empire, wasn't this all kind of predictable in some sense?
Well, it was kind of predictable that when the EU, when the US say they stand side by side with Ukraine, and this is also something the Ukrainian President Zelensky criticized at the Munich Security Conference, its words, its economic support. Some are delivering weapons, some NATO countries, but what he said he really needed were security guarantees, ideally a timeline to join NATO. But he really wanted more, and he knew he was not going to get that. So when it comes down to it, he's pretty much on his own, although we're already hearing talk of Britain, for instance, delivering more weapons. They call them defensive weapons, but in the end, you can have a legal argument. Where's the difference?
So migrants from Ukraine are already on the move. They're already moving across into Poland. for the safety and security of being in a NATO country and trying to protect their family. Of course, there's going to be a lot of people stay back, are going to fight, as is the nature of the Ukrainian people. They don't give up easily. But many families with young children, with disabled or other healthcare problems or issues, are moving into Poland. So I'd like to hear from a Polish observer in the Polish local news there what's happening with the current migration that's going on with just the Russian threats, let alone that we now are seeing and hearing about some bombings. But what's happening with the migration into Poland?
And over 1 million now live in Poland. Many fled to their western neighbor after war broke out in Donbass, and so far they've been welcome as mostly low-wage workers. The new wave of migrants has led to mixed reactions, especially due to their history of conflict.
So how are the people of Poland actually accepting these refugees, people who are fleeing war to come into their country? Let's listen to some sort of man-on-the-street interviews, and you'll hear some Polish background with the announcer speaking in English what it is that they're saying. Let's listen to some of the actual comments from ordinary people in Poland about the situation of migrants coming into their country for safety.
They killed us before. I have no love for them, but if they need help, we have to help them.
Everyone's afraid of this war because we don't know what impact it will have. It could lead to an influx of migrants to Poland and other countries. I wouldn't offer them a room, but I'd give them some food. I live alone, so I'd be afraid. I often go to the Ukrainian dentist because his prices are good and I've never been disappointed. But I can't say today whether I'll help them.
Irina Gavrilyaka hopes there won't be war or a wave of refugees. She views her own trip to Poland as a type of life insurance.
Well, Europe is on the precipice of a war. Now, how engaged Europe wants to be in this war, or whether Ukraine has to go it alone, is yet to be seen. The United States has said they stand by Ukraine, but it is not part of the protective umbrella of NATO. And so there's not much we can do except send some support, some weapons, some food, and be outraged and try to create a diplomatic solution. But it doesn't look like Putin has any interest in that. So is it true then? Let's talk to a European Union member on the council and see if he thinks that this is something that the Europeans are not willing to go to war with Russia over Ukraine. Is that true?
We are not prepared to go to war with Russia to defend Ukraine. And that's why Ukraine may have to be fighting alone.
So the reality is the United States is not going to send in troops. We're not going to go to war with Russia over Ukraine. And the European Union is not going to go to war with Russia over Ukraine. So you basically have this bully, Vladimir Putin, who can do whatever he wants and doesn't look like he's going to have anybody who can actually stand up to him and tell him no. Let's listen to the head of Ukraine and what his thoughts are about the prospects of fighting alone.
We expect clear and effective support from our partners. We'll now look closely to see who our true friends and partners are, and who will continue to try and scare off the Russian Federation with mere words.
Let's wrap up this week's session on Ukraine and Russia and the conflicts in Europe with a reporter on the ground in the war-torn country, the part of it that is already under attack from Russians, that they're sending in troops, they're sending in vehicles, they're sending in tanks. We're going to see whether they will cross the line of these separatist pieces of Ukraine and go after the whole of Ukraine. But let's listen to the on-site analysis by a reporter right there in Ukraine.
In bomb shelters, hiding. Some now thinking about whether it's time to leave that frontline zone and move a bit further away from those front lines. But obviously the biggest fear that we'll see Russia not only sending its troops to those rebel-held areas, the thing that began yesterday night, but also that we would see them crossing the front line because those separatist areas claim basically the entirety of the Donetsk and Luhansk regions, most of which are under government control, under Kiev's control. And if they make good on that promise, that would obviously see huge amounts of fighting and lots of people, lots of civilians involved in what are very densely populated areas.
So there you have it, audience. The history of Ukraine and Russia, the horrible brutality of the communist system on the Kiev people, and it's happening again. Understand what's going on and make a decision as to whether this is worth fighting for or not, as the people that ought to be involved are those in the European Union. If they're not willing to fight, then, in my opinion, the United States shouldn't take this on alone. Join us next week for another version of Healthcare Insight and what's going on nationally, internationally, and domestically. See you next week.